In the lively heart of Greenwood Park, where laughter mingled with the delicious aromas from food stalls, a seemingly joyous day took an unexpected and troubling turn. Malik, a devoted black father with a warm smile, was spending a sunlit afternoon with his beloved adopted daughter, Ella, a spirited 6-year-old with a cascade of wild blonde curls. Their connection was evident to anyone who glanced their way as their laughter echoed across the playground, creating a vibrant ripple of happiness in the park. However, this joyful scene didn't appear so simple to everyone. Among the onlookers was Mrs. White, a woman in her early 50s who prided herself on being a vigilant member of the community, though her vigilance sometimes veered into overzealousness. As Ella darted across the playground, her giggles ringing out as she dodged Malik's playful attempts to catch her, Mrs. White observed the scene with a growing unease. Malik's gentle demeanor and evident love for his daughter did not align with Mrs. White's narrow views on what a family should look like. Instead of seeing a father and daughter sharing a beautiful moment, her perception, clouded by deep-seated biases, painted a picture of something amiss. The game took a sudden turn when Ella, looking back at her father with a teasing grin, didn't notice a tree root protruding from the ground. She tripped and fell with a sharp cry, her laughter abruptly silenced. Malik was at her side in an instant, his arms enveloping her in a comforting embrace as he checked for any injuries. His voice, calm and soothing, was a gentle reassurance that this was just another small tumble in a child's day of play. But from her bench, Mrs. White saw only what her prejudices allowed. The sight of Malik, a black man, cradling a crying white child, triggered a wave of irrational fear and suspicion. With a sense of urgency, fueled not by the reality of the situation, but by her own unfounded fears, Mrs. White pulled out her phone. Her hands trembled as she dialed the police, convinced she was witnessing something far darker than a father caring for his daughter. Her decision, driven by ignorance and a narrow-minded view of the world, would soon set off a series of events that would not only challenge her own perceptions, but force the entire community to confront the harmful stereotypes that had quietly taken root in their midst. Malik continued to comfort Ella, unaware that their innocent day of fun was about to be overshadowed by a misunderstanding rooted in prejudice. Mrs. White couldn't shake the unsettling image before her, a black man tending to a distressed white child. It seemed like something out of place, far removed from her everyday reality. As Malik gently comforted little Ella, offering promises of treats and carefully tending to her scraped knee, Mrs. White's internal struggle deepened. On one hand, she saw the innocence in their interaction, with nearby parents smiling sympathetically at Malik, recognizing a scene they were all too familiar with. But on the other hand, her mind, conditioned by years of societal biases and unchecked fears, whispered doubts and cautionary tales. Her hands tightened around her phone, a device that could change the course of this moment in ways she didn't fully grasp. Thoughts of her own children surfaced, mingling with protective instincts that had always been her guide. She pondered whether she would welcome a stranger's interference if the roles were reversed. Yet the what-ifs loomed large, fueled by horror stories and sensational news that often cast men like Malik in a suspicious light. Mrs. White glanced around, searching the faces of other park-goers for some validation of her fears or perhaps a reason to dismiss them. What she found was a mix of indifference and mild curiosity, none of which mirrored the alarm she felt growing inside. Her heart raced as she weighed the potential consequences, the gravity of her decision pressing down on her. Finally, the sense of responsibility, however misguided, overwhelmed her hesitation. She dialed 911, her voice unsteady, as she reported, "There's a man here, and I think he might be harming a little girl." Her eyes stayed fixed on Malik and Ella as she described Malik to the dispatcher, her words unintentionally tinged with prejudice, casting him as more of a threat than a caring parent. After hanging up, a wave of anxiety washed over her, leaving her wondering if she had done the right thing. Doubt began to creep in, even as she watched the police cars pulling up, the sound of sirens growing louder. Malik, still comforting Ella, looked up with a mix of confusion and concern. He gently placed Ella on her feet, keeping her close as the officers approached. Ella, sensing the seriousness of the situation, clung tightly to Malik's hand, her earlier calm replaced by fear as the police made their way through the park. The atmosphere shifted. The lightheartedness that had filled the park just moments before was now replaced by a heavy tension. Onlookers began to gather, drawn by the presence of the police, their whispers and curious glances attempting to piece together the scene before them. One of the officers, stern and with a notepad in hand, addressed Malik directly. "Sir, we received a call about a potential issue involving this child. Can you explain your relationship to her?" Though his tone was professional, there was an undercurrent of suspicion that made Malik's heart sink. He remained composed, though his voice wavered slightly. "Officer, this is my daughter, Ella. I adopted her 3 years ago." He tried to keep the mood light for Ella's sake, squeezing her hand in reassurance, but the weight of the situation bore down on him. He reached into his pocket, pulling out his wallet to show pictures and the adoption papers he always carried, just in case something like this happened. Ella, overwhelmed by the crowd and the serious men questioning her father, began to whimper, burying her face in Malik's leg. Malik gently stroked her hair, his protective instincts kicking in as he continued to explain their situation to the officers. The police, after reviewing the documents and listening to Malik's calm but firm explanation, began to relax. Yet the initial coldness of their approach had already planted seeds of discomfort among the onlookers, many of whom now watched with a mix of guilt and embarrassment. Mrs. White stood there, frozen by the events she had set into motion, her inner turmoil starkly contrasting with the calm reassurances Malik continued to offer his daughter. From a distance, Mrs. White observed the unfolding scene, her unease growing with every passing moment. The documents exchanged and the evident bond between Malik and Ella made her painfully aware of the grave error she had made. What she had initially misunderstood now became glaringly clear, and with that clarity came a deep sense of regret. As the police officers wrapped up their questioning, nodding in acknowledgment of the misunderstanding, Mrs. White was overwhelmed with remorse for the turmoil she had caused to an innocent family. The officers, having thoroughly examined the adoption papers and photographs that Malik had presented, confirmed their authenticity with a nod. The mood, however, remained charged. The crowd, though somewhat relieved, continued to murmur, their suspicion not entirely dispelled. Malik, acutely aware of the eyes upon him, kept a protective arm around Ella, who clung to him, visibly shaken by the ordeal. His voice, calm but firm, carried a message to both the officers and the onlookers. "I carry these documents with me, not because I should have to prove my relationship with my daughter, but because I am all too aware that situations like this can happen." The police, sensing the lingering tension, tried to soothe the situation. One officer, raising his voice so that everyone could hear, expressed his apologies. "Thank you for your cooperation, sir. We regret the inconvenience, but we must respond to every call with due diligence." Although his words were meant to reassure, the notion that such checks were routine did little to alleviate the discomfort in the air. Ella, still clutching Malik's side, looked up at him with wide, fearful eyes. Malik offered her a reassuring squeeze on the shoulder, whispering that everything was fine, though his gaze, sweeping across the crowd, revealed the frustration and hurt he felt. His words, laden with the weight of the situation, seemed to resonate with some in the crowd, who began to look uncomfortable, perhaps recognizing the role their silent assumptions had played in the escalation of events. Mrs. White, the one who had initiated the call to the police, stood at the periphery of the gathering, her initial certainty now replaced by a growing sense of guilt. The sight of a family subjected to such intense scrutiny because of her actions filled her with shame. Tentatively, she stepped forward, compelled by a need to make things right. As the officers concluded their business, reminding the crowd to be more thoughtful in the future, Malik took a deep breath, preparing himself to address Mrs. White and those who remained. He recognized this as an opportunity, not just for his and Ella's sake, but for the broader understanding of the community. As the crowd began to disperse, Mrs. White approached Malik with hesitant steps, an apology forming on her lips, though uncertain of how it would be received. Malik, seeing her approach, braced himself for the conversation ahead. He knew that what he was about to say was crucial, not just for him and Ella, but for the community's growth and awareness. With Ella still by his side, Malik turned to face Mrs. White, who was now only a few steps away. The remaining onlookers, sensing the importance of the moment, allowed them space but remained attentive. Mrs. White's face was a picture of regret, her previous resolve now replaced with doubt and shame. "There's something I need to explain," Malik began, his voice steady though still strained from the ordeal. "I became Ella's father not just because I wanted to be a dad, but because her biological parents couldn't provide her with the safety and love she needed. They were in a very dark place, dealing with things that made their home dangerous." He paused, pulling a small toy from his pocket to keep Ella distracted, shielding her from the harsher realities of her past. "When the chance came to give Ella a stable home, I didn't hesitate. I knew she needed a shot at a normal, happy life, something her biological parents, trapped in their struggles, simply couldn't give her." Malik's voice carried the weight of both sorrow and determination as he spoke, not just to Mrs. White, but to everyone present. He explained the intricate reality of adoption, highlighting that it's far more than just offering a child a new home. It's about giving them what they deserve: stability, affection, and a safe space to grow. "That's my goal every single day," he said, his tone unwavering. Mrs. White listened, her eyes welling up as she started to comprehend how deeply she had misjudged him and his dedication to his daughter. The realization of her prejudice, based solely on Malik's appearance and her preconceived notions, struck her hard. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I didn't see the whole picture. I thought I was helping, but I was wrong. I judged too quickly." Malik gave a slow nod, the tension in his body easing slightly. "I appreciate your apology, Mrs. White. It's crucial to recognize how easily situations can be misinterpreted, especially when our biases get in the way. We all have a lot to learn about compassion and understanding." His words weren't just for Mrs. White. They resonated with everyone around, serving as a gentle reminder of the perils of snap judgments and the necessity of empathy in any community. Mrs. White stepped back, giving Malik and his daughter Ella the space they deserved. She stood there, humbled, as the crowd gradually dispersed. Yet the impact of the moment lingered, planting seeds of a new understanding in the hearts of those who had witnessed the exchange. As Malik took Ella's hand and prepared to leave the park, he felt a mix of bittersweet emotions. The day had been challenging, but it also hinted at the possibility of growth and healing within the community. In the following weeks, Greenwood Park slowly returned to its vibrant self, but the memory of that day stayed with everyone who had been there. Malik and Ella continued to visit the park, their presence a quiet reminder of the lessons learned. The families who had witnessed the incident became more mindful, and discussions about bias and empathy became more frequent in the community. Mrs. White, deeply affected by her experience, decided to make a difference. She began volunteering at a local community center, working tirelessly to bridge divides and create a more inclusive environment. The encounter with Malik and Ella had left a lasting impression on her, and she was determined to channel her newfound awareness into positive actions. For Malik and Ella, life moved forward, their bond only growing stronger after the challenges they had overcome together. Malik knew that the world could be harsh, but he also believed in the power of education and empathy to bring about change. He became increasingly involved in community activities, sharing his story in hopes of raising awareness and promoting understanding. Slowly but surely, Greenwood Park started to transform. It became a place where differences were not just tolerated, but celebrated, and where the true essence of family was recognized and cherished by everyone. The story of Malik and Ella's struggle and the growth it inspired became an integral part of Greenwood Park's history, a testament to love, resilience, and the importance of confronting our own biases. As time passed, the park remained a haven of joy and connection. Families of all kinds came together, thriving in a space that welcomed everyone. Malik and Ella's presence continued to be a beacon of hope, a constant reminder that understanding and compassion can lead us toward a brighter, more inclusive future.